Do you want to work for a fast-growing strategy consultancy? Stax is a boutique firm hiring now for multiple roles across its 3 U.S. offices and rapidly expanding London office. With top-of-the-market compensation, fast-paced projects, and the opportunity to be promoted quickly, Stax is an attractive place to start or continue your consulting career. So if you're looking for a consulting role in a rigorous environment, working side by side with senior leaders on engagements across industries and project types, Stax might be the perfect firm for you. Find open positions plus job descriptions and requirements at the link in the show notes or at stax.com/careers. That's stax.com/careers. You're listening to Strategy Simplified and another live case interview demonstration. Today's case is a McKinsey-style case. It's an automotive industry case, and it's led by Kabreya, who is a former, get this, McKinsey, Bridgespan, and PwC consultant. So she has a rock star background, and she's also a management consultant case coach who works with candidates to help them prepare for case interviews and consulting recruiting. Listen to this episode to learn the key strategies and frameworks that a top candidate uses to succeed, and to get actionable takeaways to sharpen your case skills just in time for upcoming deadlines and lateral hire recruiting. Kabreya has coached dozens of candidates to offers at firms like McKinsey, Bain, BCG, and much more, and she'd love to work with you. Check out the links in this episode's show notes to learn more about Kabreya and to learn how to work with her for one-on-one coaching. Let's get into the episode.
Okay. Ready, Yuri?
Let's do it.
Okay, great. So our client is an American automotive manufacturer whose market share has been slowly declining over the past couple of years. And more worryingly, their EBIT is in the red. So our client has asked you to help them understand the differences in economics between our client and its main competitors, in addition to the key factors that would impact sales of new cars in North America. So for purpose of simplicity, competitors are categorized as either other American manufacturers or Japanese and South Korean manufacturers. With all that said, how would you structure your approach to this problem?
Great. So just to make sure that I got all that information right, our client is an American auto company.
Mhm.
They've been experiencing declining market share and negative EBITDA in the last few years. Uh, Our goal is to look at new car sales, specifically in North America, and compare that relative to other manufacturers in the US, as well as the other competitors coming from manufacturers from Japan and Korea. Does that sound about right?
Yep, that sounds right to me.
Great. So just to make sure that I'm really understanding the goal here, is our primary concern to understand the revenue side here, or is this more of an overarching EBITDA question? And is there sort of like a metric, like a concrete number that we're looking at to improve?
Yeah, so we're still working with the client to figure out what the North Star would be. But I think in general, what they're concerned about is the fact that one, market share has been slowly eroding, and two, the fact that there is an EBIT problem. So I would look at both.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's to understand the EBITDA problem as a whole and the declining market share. So it's not like we're focusing either on revenues or on the sales side or on the cost side. We're looking at a little bit more holistically here. Great, that makes a lot of sense. And then just to make sure I'm understanding the business correctly, so is this an automotive manufacturer that then sells to dealerships who then sell to the consumer, or do they have their own dealerships and they're selling to the consumer? How does that business process look like?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. For the purpose of this, I wouldn't necessarily focus too much on how they actually distribute their cars. I think the most important thing is that they're just a US-based manufacturer. But you can imagine that they follow a similar model to traditional car manufacturers that you are well aware of.
Right. And then one last piece of understanding here. EBIT is in the red, so I'm assuming in terms of the timing, we're looking to find a solution pretty much as soon as possible. Is that the right way to think about it, or is there a longer timeline that we're looking at?
Yeah, again, management hasn't given us a clear directive, but since it's in the red, you can imagine that there's some urgency there.
Absolutely, that makes total sense. Great. I think That's great information for me to get started. Mind if I take a moment to structure my thoughts here?
Sure, go for it.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Strategy Simplified, are you ready to land your dream consulting or corporate strategy job? On the Management Consultant job board, we've made it easier than ever to do just that. Create your free job seeker profile today and instantly unlock access to hundreds of top-tier job opportunities, all at no cost to you. Don't wait. Start your journey towards your dream career now through the Management Consultant job board. Your future in consulting is just one click away. Find the link to create your job seeker profile at the link in this episode's show notes.
Great. So in thinking about this problem, a couple approaches that I want to take this. So first, I would love to get a better understanding of our clients' unit economics, and then moving to understand sort of the competitive environment as a whole and how we would benchmark to them with them. So starting with our client, would love to break it down into both the sales and the cost. So starting with the car sales here, really looking to understand the revenues by the car type. So I'm wondering if they sell electric cars versus like your traditional vehicle, or if there's any differences between like low cost, like low price, middle tier, or the luxury end. Seeing if there's any differences there, and has there been any element that we've been particularly declining in terms of sales in the recent years. Looking more so on the cost side. On that side, I would break it down into both the variable and fixed cost elements. So fixed costs when associated with the car manufacturer, I'm thinking of the facilities where they're manufacturing these cars, the insurance associated with that, maybe even like safety inspections that they would need for each car, for like the overall car. On the variable cost side, I would think of the labor associated with manufacturing these cars, the raw materials, the distribution elements of getting materials from one point to the other and getting the car ultimately to the dealership. So would love to get a pretty holistic understanding of our client, and then taking a understanding of the competitive environment for the US car industry. I would love to break down our competitors between our international competitors and our domestic competitors. So starting with the international competitors, would still love to get a sense of the unit economics and see how we compare to them. My initial thought is that maybe that our costs might be higher relative to the international market, and that maybe is allowing these international car manufacturers to price similar vehicles at a lower price that is then shifting the market share. But would love to dig further and see if we have any sort of more concrete economics on the typical sales price per car, associated costs that I mentioned before. On domestic, also looking to understand similarly those elements that I mentioned in international, and if we could also benchmark the market share of all of these competitors and ourselves for the last few years, to see while we have been losing market share, who's sort of been taking up that space. Has the market itself, has it been shrinking, staying stagnant, growing? Just to get a better understanding of, is it that we're actively losing share, or is the market growing so fast and we're just not taking that additional appropriate share? With those two things being said, an additional element that I didn't mention, but I meant to add, was that of consumers. So I would love to understand from the point of view of the driver, is there any type of car that they're looking for? So I'm wondering if they prefer a car that's like more associated with safety, or if they would prefer it to be manufactured in a specific area, or if like price is their key concern. Getting an understanding of what their key purchasing criteria, I think, will help us best navigate what our North Star for this organization should be in the long term. That being said, I think it's very important to understand a little bit more why that EBITDA is in the red. So would love to see, do we have any figures on either like the sales or costs of our organization?
Yeah, so we actually do have some information on costs. So management just gave us a high level list in terms of the type of costs associated with car manufacturing for them. So for variable costs, there's four key ones. The first being material costs. So you can think of that as being raw materials and outsourced pre-assembled components.
Yeah.
Second being distribution expenses. Third being warranty expenses. And then the fourth being sales incentives and other promotions. On the fixed cost side, similarly, there's also four cost buckets. So the first being employee wages. So that includes anything from basic pay plus benefits like pension and healthcare. And it's sometimes considered semi-variable depending on the type of contract. Plant overhead is the second fixed cost, includes maintenance, depreciation, electricity, things of the like. Third cost being marketing expenses, and then finally capital investment, which would include anything from new plants, refurbishing plants, decommissioning plants, and just general R&D. From that list that I just gave you, would be curious to get your sense of what you think would be relevant to actually producing a car. So in other words, like what would be the manufacturing plant costs?
Gotcha. Okay. So just walking through all these costs, just making sure that I didn't miss anything. For variable costs, we have the material costs, the distribution, warranty, and sales. For fixed costs, we have wages, plant overhead, marketing, and then capital investment. I missed what were all of the buckets that fit under capital investment?
Yeah, so that's just new plants,
Oh, okay.
refurbishing plants, decommissioning plants, and just general R&D.
Gotcha. So in terms of which ones I would say tie more so with the manufacturing of a car, I think starting with variable costs, it's going to be the material costs to manufacture that car. Um, Walking through the other ones, for distribution, the car is already manufactured. For warranty, the car is already manufactured. Sales, it's already done. So for variable costs, it would only be the material. And then for fixed costs, wages, that is one that stands out to me, the people working at the manufacturing plant. And then secondly, being a plant overhead. Marketing is something that would happen once the car's already manufactured. Uh, for cap investment, this is one that I'm in between. You mentioned refurbishing plants. I'm thinking that may also be relevant if there's an issue with the plant um, while we're manufacturing a car. Granted, I think that that's probably on like a case by case basis. But in terms of sort of the big three here, I would think that it would be uh, material, wages, and plant overhead. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me. And I know your point, totally understand about capital investment. Though it's part of the company's general expense, I do think there is some room to consider the plant specific investments as being related to producing a car.
Gotcha.
Um,
Okay.
Great. Our research has just shows that we've done shows that the average car that our client produced costs $9,000 to build. We know it takes 20 hours per vehicle to build a car, and that assemblers earn $35 per hour, but the actual cost the client incurs is actually $85 per hour once we include benefits and things of the like. We also know that the plant or that a plant can produce cars at a rate of 60 jobs per hour. So if we assume that overhead costs per car are $300, what percentage of a car's assembly costs comes from its materials?
Right. So just to make sure that I got all of that right. So the average car you mentioned costs $9,000. It takes approximately 20 hours per vehicle. An assembler is making $25 an hour, but after considering uh, all of the
35.
other 35.
Yes.
But after considering sort of their benefits and all of that, it bubbles up to 85 an hour.
Yes, correct.
Gotcha. And then one car yields 60 jobs per hour.
One plant.
One plant. Okay. one plant is 60 jobs per hour. Overhead is 300,000.
$300 per car.
$300 per car. And then our goal is I actually missed the audio on that point. What was the overall goal?
So from all this, would love to know what percentage of a car's assembly cost comes from its materials.
Gotcha. Okay, so the percentage of assembly that comes from material. Great. So just sort of walking through the way that I would structure this. So we have the total of 9,000, which is ultimately what we'd be subtracting from. We know that it's about 20 hours per vehicle. Each hour is $85 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would add after that $300 per car. And then that remaining bit from the 9,000 would be the amount that we're looking for. So just to walk through that real quick, first I would calculate the labor hours, then I would add in the overhead, and I would subtract that from the 9,000. Does that all make sense?
Yep, that makes sense to me.
Great. So the total amount of, see, just making sure that so 85 times 20, we're looking at, let's see, 170, 1.7K.
Mm-hmm.
Plus 300, that gets us 2K. And then the 9K minus 2K, that's going to get us 7K. And we're looking at, so it's 7,000 in material costs. So 7 divided by 9, that's going to be close to, what is it? 77%, 75%. Roughly 75% of all assembly costs come from material costs. So a big chunk of our associated costs in manufacturing a car comes from materials. I'm wondering if it's the same for our competitors. Are they getting more favorable rates? And like, are their average costs per car also similar? Do we have any details on sort of how we benchmark relative to competitors, both international and domestic?
Yeah, so we do have some research about our sharpest competitor, which is a Japanese manufacturer. So it takes them 5 hours less to assemble each car, and their workers only cost the company $60 per hour, and that includes benefits. However, both material costs and overhead costs are roughly the same. So from this information, could you estimate the average production cost for a competitor's car?
Absolutely. Just making sure that I got that. So the Japanese competitor, they're able to produce a car in 5 hours less. So in 15 hours, and instead of 85 an hour, it was 50,
60.
60. I'm glad that I'm checking. Yeah, absolutely. We can calculate that. You mentioned that overhead and the material costs are roughly the same, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Great. So to calculate the amount saved here, I mean, we really could just walk through the same process again. So we know it's about 7,000 in material costs. Overhead's going to be 300, and then the new cost per labor, that's going to be the $15 an hour times times 60. So that's going to be about 900. Just making sure that I got that right.
900 sounds right to me.
Yeah, 900's right. So 7,000 plus 300 plus 900, that's going to get us to about 8.2 thousand. So 8.2 thousand as opposed to 9K. The Japanese competitor, they're saving $800 per car relative to us. So their costs are a little less than 10% lower. We'll call it 8% lower. I mean, I'm imagining that the car manufacturing industry has, I'm trying to recall it from a case from what I recall, I think they have fairly tight margins. So, I mean, if the Japanese manufacturer is saving 8%, that could be a pretty sizable amount. And I'm wondering, is that difference for us, at least the difference, but if we were to save 8%, would we no longer be in the red? Do we have any details on how close we are to the red? Are we like
Unfortunately,
2%
we
in the
don't
red?
have that
Okay.
information yet. But I think in addition to just comparing us to our competitors, there is also another important consideration. Which is the capacity of production of plants and their ability to increase and decrease production. So in a case team meeting, we had a conversation about that, and we were able to get some information. So our plant works 250 days a year and on 8-hour shifts, 2 shifts per day, and can produce 60 cars per hour. So I'd be curious, what is the annual capacity for our client?
Gotcha. Okay. So our current capacity is 250 days a year. We could do 60 cars per day,
Mm-hmm.
and then 8-hour shifts.
Yep.
Is that the right?
So,
Okay.
or 60 cars per hour. Sorry, just to
Oh,
correct you.
60 cars per hour. Okay.
Yes,
And then we're open for 8 hours a day
with 2 shifts per day.
with 2 shifts. Okay, great.
So 8-hour shifts, 2 of them per day.
Okay, great. And then we want to know how many cars we can produce a year.
Yes.
Great. So we have, the way I would calculate this is we could get cars per day. And then from there we would multiply that by about 250. So just like looking across, the way that we would multiply this is we would take the 250 days times 60
Mhm.
cars times 8 times 2. And then the order that we multiply that doesn't particularly matter. So just for the ease, since we're multiplying that out, I would take the 2, multiply it by 250 to get us 500. 6 times 60 times 8 is 480. And then 480 times 500 is let's see, it's going to be 240,000 cars per year.
Yep.
So 240,000 cars per year. We're looking at a cost of 9,000. So I mean, let's call it 200, 2.2 million, is it? In terms of total cost,
I think it might be one
or
more order
22.
of magnitude. So
Yeah,
I think
22 million in cost per year. Our so 22 million, our competitor is saving, assuming that they're also producing at capacity and that we're both producing at capacity, the Japanese competitor would be able to save about an additional 22 million over us. That sounds like a pretty sizable opportunity if we were able to lock in on what those opportunity costs may be. I'm
Mhm.
also wondering, since we are looking at like this is the maximum capacity, how close are we to operating at maximum capacity? Are we like 80% of the way there, or?
So we unfortunately don't have that information, though management has talked to us about potentially looking at how we can infuse some more flexibility in their production, given, as you mentioned, it's a $2 billion in manufacturing costs. They're assuming that hopefully if they can be more flexible, they might be able to realize economies of scale when needed. We'll love your thoughts, though, on how we could infuse some flexibility in their current production model based off what you know of their current production operations.
Gotcha. So introduce some efficiency in terms of the model.
Or
I'm
just
wondering,
flexibility in terms of number of cars that they can produce in a given time.
Yeah. Well, looking at the Japanese manufacturer, the first thing that stood out to me is that they're able to produce a car in 15 hours. I'm wondering are there elements maybe that we could take from that Japanese manufacturer to flex up how quickly we can produce a car. So then instead of making 60 cars an hour, we're able to produce 80, 90 cars an hour. I think closer to 75 cars an hour. That would, I guess, thinking more practically on what that would mean, I'm wondering, well, breaking this down into two elements. So first, like internally, what are the easy wins? And then externally, what could we like benchmark from competitors? So I guess that would fall more under the benchmarks. But internally, I'm thinking of, are we investing in like automation, or is a lot of this like manual work? Are we fully utilizing the time of our employees, or is it like the first half of an 8-hour shift is productive and then the latter half might not be as efficient? Looking more externally, that would be where it would fall under like what are our competitors doing relative to us? So what is that Japanese company especially doing that is bringing their times down to 15 an hour rather than the 20? Additionally, maybe like, are they applying like just-in-time practices?
Mm-hmm.
Or are there of those like Kanban elements that like make the supply chain generally go faster? That
Yeah.
being said, I think the most useful one that I would go through is to look at like what the Japanese manufacturer is doing.
Yep. It seems like you're really well versed on Toyota manufacturing. So, um, well, beyond just looking at the company internally, the client really picked McKinsey because we are the data people, and so part of our engagement is going to involve us creating a market model. This model is we hope is going to predict or project consumer behavior, so we can ultimately estimate the number of vehicles that our client and each of its competitors should be able to sell. Now, before we actually start building this model, would love to get your thoughts on what potential variables you think would be important to include.
Yeah, so just to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, so uh, the goal of this market model then is to um, model the like, total addressable market for new car sales in the US.
Yeah, so mainly we're trying to hope they're asking us to build a model to project out what the demand will look like both for ourselves as well as for our competitors within the North American market.
Gotcha. Okay, great. So in and for this model, are we looking for it in terms of dollars, or are we looking in terms of like cars?
I think you need to
Cars,
think
right?
about it in terms of what variables, what inputs you would think
Okay.
would be relevant. So you don't necessarily have to think about dollars or cars.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Um, so I guess in terms of what variables are relevant, I, I think I'm just naturally thinking about this a bit more in dollars, but I would think about this in terms of like what are the key volume drivers and what are the key sort of like price drivers.
Hmm.
Um, Starting with the volume drivers in the US, um, I would think of like what is how many new drivers do we have
Hmm.
entering the space per year? Or like new people or people who have an existing car that are looking to sort of replace that car and get a new one. So we have those two new people that are coming into the market. So new drivers and then people looking to sort of sell their car, get a new one. Um, Starting with new drivers, I think to project that we would have to get an understanding of, um, well, one, how many new drivers are there per year? I would imagine in the US, that's something that's fairly stable. It's not like our population has been growing um, at an insane rate. So we could get a best estimate from there. And then we would have to segment it by how many of them are getting used cars and how many of them are getting new cars. And then the new cars percentage, that would be the amount that we're taking into our model. For the people who are looking to sort of just get another car, retire their current car, I would think that we would want to know what is the average turnover per car. I think it's, I know we don't necessarily need this number, but I thought it was something like 6 or 7 years. I feel like I saw that somewhere. But to see like how long does a typical person have their car, and then we could just take the existing driving population and divide that by that like number of years to get a new car, to get how many people are looking for a car in a given year. And then beyond the people who are retiring the car, another element is just people who are looking to get a second or third new car. So this is going to be looking at a bit more like affluent individuals, which I imagine is probably going to be the smallest segment of the three that I mentioned, but still may make up 10-20% of the market, depending on how we look into that.
Totally.
And then,
actually, that's actually a great list. But actually, the client is here. So do you mind giving us a quick wrap up of what we've done so far as a status update?
yeah, absolutely. So our goal was to get an understanding of how our market share and how and why the EBIT has changed and why the EBITDA is in the red. From our current understanding, we see that our organization relative to the nearest Japanese competitor is over 10% more costly in terms of the manufacturing space, and is less efficient when it comes to creating a car. Additionally, we've also begun to implement the first steps into developing a market model of how we would best estimate the demand drivers for both ourselves and the competitor, and have just begun working through how we would segment that by the market. But overall, the biggest key takeaway that we found is that our organization is about 10% more costly than competitors. And in terms of next steps of what we should look there, we should see if we can apply any of the competitors' practices to make our cars less costly on a unit basis for us.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And scene. So great job, Yuri, with this case. I know it's a bit of it kind of deviates from your standard case. So let's just go over it really quickly. So in terms of your case, the case stem, setting it up, I think you did a really good job of replaying things in a very nice and succinct manner. And your questions also, I could understand where you were going with the logic. The one call out I would say is that you're asking, is it a revenue problem or a cost problem? Generally, you're going to kind of explore that in the case. So I wouldn't necessarily be so forthfront and be like, what is it? Because I can actually be like, well, I don't know. Maybe we'll figure it out. Right. But in terms of let's go into the first math question, or into your framework, sorry. I think you did a good job of segmenting what you thought was important, which was understanding the economics of our client, right? And looking at the revenue and the cost drivers, as well as trying to figure out this competitive comparison, which is, I guess, the wrinkle here that makes it slightly different than like a traditional profitability case, which is, right, we're losing market share. So we also want to know what our competitors have. The one thing I would say here is that cars are slightly unique in that people have preferences about their cars, right? Certain people like to drive a BMW. There's a certain type of consumer who wants a BMW versus, a Toyota Camry. So I would wish that you kind of went into like the kind of intangibles, or kind of the less quantifiable bits, like the qualitative aspects of what are the differences between our client from a value prop perspective relative to competitors. But overall, I felt like it was a fairly comprehensive framework. Going into the math, so I'll kind of go they were all fairly simple math. And so this is just, I think, a watch out for most folks. If the math is fairly simple, that means that you're likely supposed to come up with good insights about it, because I'm not making you do so much hard calculating. And I think you did a good job of coming up with the beyond level 1 to likely level 2, level 3 insights. So particularly with respect to our cost relative to our competitors, right? You recognize that, a 50% decrease, or like that, 5 hours less of work from our Japanese competitor. They were still able to be cost competitive, but it was like their costs were still 90% of what our costs are. The one thing that I was curious about that she didn't really bring up is, if you realize that the Japanese can do it cheaper, like why not just move production there, right? So that's like a potential option. You can offshore or outsource work there, given that it is, to your point, materials are fairly commoditized, so there's not really room there to budge in terms of cost savings. That could be a potential to consider of like, what would it look like to shift operations to a cheaper place? But again, I think the insights that you brought there were great. Then rounding it out, I guess, to the model, which again, I'm assuming you've never been asked what are some variables to consider when creating a model, but that is something that McKinsey does do. Oftentimes people want to leverage our data analytics. I think you did a good job. You were focusing more, I think, on the volume aspect. I think there are some also qualitative things just to understand, which is like consumer demographics, like who are the consumers? What is their disposable income? What are their personal preferences? You mentioned some stuff in your framework, which I thought I was waiting for you to bring up, like, are they considering safety as a bigger factor relative to something else? But I think overall you dealt with the ambiguity of that question fairly well. And then the wrap up, I think you were able to succinctly bring it together in terms of what we did and also next steps, especially given that in this case, we didn't really fully answer the question. There's still more work to go. But we wanted to get a status update to, our client. So I would say good job on dealing with the ambiguity. There's some things here that are slightly more specific to the automotive industry that I think not many people would know, such as the commoditization of materials. But overall, great job.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yuri. Well done. Thank you, Kabreya, for leading a very interesting case. Okay, well, we're going to transition to some Q&A with the last couple of minutes that we have left. So how this is going to work is that you can just type in your questions, and we will kind of take them one by one. So whether you're here on Zoom or LinkedIn or YouTube or somewhere else, we'd love to take your questions. So whether it's something about like the case, so something that was interesting, or maybe you need some clarification about, and then something about case interview prep more generally, like we'd love to take that. Kabreya would love to take those questions, and anything else you might have. Okay, let's get started. So I'm gonna go to the chat here. So Trenton has a question about how would we go about getting sector-based data on market share? What would the question framing be? Kabreya, you okay to take that one?
Yeah, so I'm assuming it's the question is if someone asks you similar to what I asked Yuri in terms of like what are the things that you would consider. Again, I think during these interviews we don't expect everyone to be knowledgeable about every single sector. Not everyone has exposure to working in the automotive sector, for example. But I think generally for this, part of it is just general business intuition in terms of you want to understand from just a market share perspective, whatever the object is. So in this case, it's cars. You want to know how many cars are being sold by how many competitors, right? What is the sale price to kind of get a sense of scale and size. And in terms of others, I think, again, this is where you kind of leverage your own personal experience with cars in this example, right? Which is like, that people who drive a Buick are slightly different than people who drive a Prius, right? There are different trends that you will likely be aware of. For example, I think Yuri made a good point about electric vehicles and the trends in terms of how do we fit into this trend of people trying to become more eco-conscious. So it's a bit tricky, but again, I would default to saying some of it is going to be inherent business 101, which is you just need to understand the economics of how it works of like any industry, which is units times price times quantity sold. The other is just going to be based off your own understanding of the industry.
Okay, that's helpful. Getting a couple of questions around like note taking and taking down numbers. So do you have any best practice advice on how to best take notes when you're being given like a math problem?
Yeah. So generally the way that I, structure my page is I think about it horizontally, and you kind of have a line, a column to the left, which is like the pertinent stuff from the case stem. Then you have a line that crosses the top to the top, which is like the core question to kind of be your North Star. And then in terms of details of math, I just generally write down all of the key points that they give me, replay it. And generally what I do, which I think Yuri did a really good job, is he walk through his logic in terms of what variables he needs and what he's ultimately getting to, right? So for example, in the case of identifying plant production capacity, right? So he was saying, I need to know how many cars we can produce an hour, how many shifts we have per hour or per day, how long are those shifts, and then how many days are we actually operating. And so kind of walking through the algebra problem that you need to solve, I think is the way that I generally prefer it, but that's just the way that my brain works. That's what I would recommend for folks, is kind of you get all the numbers and then kind of take a moment to play around and see how do these all, relate to each other.
Great, that's helpful. And then if if I missed a number, I missed a couple of numbers, and I need you to repeat some information. Do you have a framing for how to like ask that,
Yeah,
nicely?
yeah, and I think that's totally fine, right? Oftentimes we throw a lot at you, and we don't expect you guys to be able to remember everything that we say. I think Yuri did a really good job here. He's like, just to make sure that I'm tracking, I just want to confirm these numbers, and the ones that he knew, he confirmed with me. And he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't get the last number. Do you mind repeating how many is for the last section that he missed?" And that's like a great way of asking. Again, you don't get docked for not being able to write and all the numbers correctly, right? We're here to help you as much as we are to evaluate. So completely fine to do that in that way.
Great. Question from Umar. When is it okay to ask for some time to like structure your thoughts or structure your math or brainstorm?
Yeah. So generally there's some parts of a case where you are given time or it's expected, right? So looking at the case framework, when you're given the initial stem, we recommend 2 minutes. And I think you already did a good job. He did it slightly under at 1 minute 40. For other points, I think you can just ask, hey, can I have a moment to structure my thoughts? But just be prepared for if they say no, right? So ultimately, the times that I see it with clients is when we're giving the final recommendation, they might ask for a moment to structure their thoughts. And I will give them both, right? To say, no, clients right here, you actually have to be able to present. And so in that way, I think structuring the work that you're doing on your paper is really helpful in making sure you know what the key insights are. So for example, for me, I generally will like star or circle key insights. So when I'm giving my final recommendation, I can refer back and quickly be able to know what are the poignant parts of each part of the case.
Love it. And that kind of translates to like the real world in consulting, right? You don't
Yep.
always have the option to
Yeah,
step out of the room if the client asks. You got to be on your toes, get to think on your
totally.
feet.
And it's not to be mean to your point, right? It's really emulating the case experience on the ground. Like oftentimes I've had clients come in and without any, a head forward or heads up, they'll ask me like, so what's going on right now? And I have to give them a status update, right? So it's a very valuable skill to be able to speak live and off the cuff. You tend to build that muscle more as you are in the profession. But yeah, unfortunately and fortunately, it's something that you're gonna have to get used to.
Yeah. So what you're telling me is that the case interview is right. It's based on what you're going to be like in consulting. And so maybe if someone today you're like, oh man, I didn't like this. Like this was wrong. I think one of those most valuable things that somebody can take out of one of these sessions is maybe consulting isn't right for me, because we don't want you to spend 3 months preparing for a job that maybe you would hate if you were to get an offer. And so I think that's like valuable insights as far as just your experience of cases. Okay, love it. Okay, question. Let me see. So kind of a question here, then I'll add something to it. Is it frowned upon to use a calculator during the case? That
So I Yeah, so generally it's assumed that you should be able to do all the calculations without a calculator, namely because it's supposed to emulate, oftentimes you're with a client and you're doing back of the envelope math. So all the math really should not be something that's like very difficult to do. There are definitely tips and tricks in order to be able to make it faster to be able to do it. But you can assume, especially if you're doing for all cases, but especially in person, like you're not allowed to bring a calculator. You're just gonna have to work on it old school.
And then do you have a couple of tips and tricks that you can share for right getting faster, getting more accurate at mental math?
Yeah. So I think for me, the one trick that I always had was that zeros really confused me. So I always ended up using scientific notation so I could eliminate the zeros and be able to calculate and figure out how many zeros are at the end of my problems. But beyond that, like there's some things like, for example, if you are trying to figure out like what is 90% of something, you could just calculate what 10% is and subtract that from the total, right? Like there's some tricks in terms of just mathematically, they both get you the right answer, but just different framing makes it easier to calculate. And also using, for example, when you're dividing, leveraging reciprocals to help make the math easier for you to do.
Absolutely. Kabreya, so you've been in a couple different interview cycles, and I'm going to make the assumption that you did both in-person interviews as well as virtual
Yep.
interviews throughout the various. Okay, great. So two questions around that. Number one is just key differences keep in mind for virtual versus in person. I know like a lot of firms right now, they're doing first rounds are virtual and then final rounds,
Yep.
they might fly you in person. So for folks who are dealing with that scenario, key differences.
Yeah. So I think that the key difference I would say is that you don't have the person watching you. So you don't necessarily have, especially when you're doing Zoom interviews. So it's not like you can show them your paper and have them follow through your framework. And so what I recommend for people over Zoom or doing cases over Zoom is that you have to be really structured in terms of how you present your framework or just anything that you're doing, because in theory, they could be trying to emulate what you're saying on their own paper to bring back when they do deliberations. So a concrete example is, if I'm talking about profitability, I could say, my framework, I think about it in terms of 3 buckets, right? So I make it very clear if I'm trying to write it out, what it's going to look like. Within each bucket, I have 3 areas that I want to explore. The first being X, the second being Y, the third being Z, right? So being really structured or more structured than you would if you were to actually sit next to somebody and show them your paper and walk through it. And similarly, you can do that with the math portion, right? So really walking through how you're going to calculate each calculation, which I think you already did a really great job of telling me he's going to multiply this by this by this to get the ultimate answer. I think are really great ways to kind of mitigate the loss of connection that you necessarily have when you have someone in front of you during a case interview. And beyond that, the only other thing I would say is that over Zoom, they tend to be a little bit more, I guess, emotionally straining, just because for whatever reason, a Zoom somehow is just more draining. At least for me, it feels like it is. And so for that's more so just getting used to doing things over Zoom and kind of finding ways to energize you to keep momentum going. If you are particularly extroverted like myself and feed off people's energies, particularly if you're in person.
That's valuable information and insights there. Is there an expectation to show your notes and maybe like split this out in like virtual versus in person?
In virtual, no, there's no expectation to show notes. Generally, I know some people like to whiteboard or use Zoom whiteboarding functions. I generally advise against, just because there's just so much that could go wrong. In person, you are actually showing your paper, right? Like you are working with somebody. It's almost like you're sitting next to each other and you're showing your paper as you're walking through, which is why I think in person, the cleanliness of your page, if that makes sense, or the structure is more important, because a partner is actually going to watch you go through the case. So they will make some judgment in terms of how you, orient and how you structure your paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Kabreya, can you share your approach to working with candidates? Like, let's just say you've got someone coming to you, he's got an interview in a month, like, and he's a black belt, so he's got a couple sessions to work with. What's going to be your approach there?
Well, I think about casing is almost like speaking a different language or learning another language, which is you kind of need to understand the basic building blocks of a case and a business like speak before you can actually start, having great conversations and adding your own flair. And so generally where I start off is doing a diagnostic and understanding where people are in the process. How familiar are we with the flow, right? How familiar are you with the frameworks that generally all business problems kind of fall into? There's a lot of business problems, but there's really, if you distill them, there's only a certain level, a number of frameworks that you can really apply. Beyond that, once we go through that, then we'll go through the more tactical things, which is like, how can we structure? I will do structuring drills with you where I will give you multiple problems and ask you to structure them and present them to me. Namely for you to get the frameworks down pack, but also to be able to understand how you customize them for any given situation. And how are you able to tell me that, describe your whole framework in a succinct 2-minute slot. And then we do math. Obviously, math tips and tricks. If it is not your strong suit, it was not mine. So teaching you the practical things that you can do to make your life easier. And then once you kind of get those basics down, then it's really, let's look about your personal individual experience and see how we can leverage that insight into creating great answers. Sitting from the position of an interviewer, I've always found the folks who brought in creative answers that leveraged their backgrounds to be the ones that I remembered most when we were evaluating or doing the debrief about candidates, because it would say something that I wouldn't necessarily think. And I'm like, wow, that's great. That's somebody I kind of want on my team to kind of push my thinking and give me something that I, maybe naturally have not thought of.
That's awesome. Really appreciate that perspective. Kind of a follow-up to that is for someone who maybe, right, they've got an interview with Bain in 8 days, and they've done very little case prep. Any tips for getting up to speed really fast?
Yeah, totally. I think the Bain word is getting smart, if I remember from my Bridgeband days. One, I would make sure that you are very familiar with the flow of how case interviews work, right? In terms of STEM, what are your expectations? What do you expect the interviewer to do, and understanding that Bain has a candidate-led approach as opposed to McKinsey, which is more interviewer-led. Beyond that, then I would really focus on making sure you understand frameworks and understand how you can apply them to different business situations. And business situations also including, some social sector, because Bain does a lot of social sector, if one was not aware. And then what I would do is try to get targeted time of actually applying it. So, if you can get case time with a coach, that is ultimately the best, but having folks actually case you. And so you get the experience of being in a pressured environment where you have to kind of react to somebody in real time. I know oftentimes doing a case by yourself, it's a lot easier because you got to have that sense of pressure, but it is kind of a pressure test when you're doing a case interview at MBB, right? They want to see how you respond, particularly under time constraints and the like.
Thanks for following along to this McKinsey case led by Kabreya. I trust you really got a lot out of it by following along with your pencil and paper. If you need some expert feedback on your case interview skills, then work with a coach like Kabreya through our Black Belt program, through our Super Prep program. Links in the show notes to learn more. They'd love to help you get ready and make the most of your opportunities to land a consulting offer. Links in the show notes to learn more. And this is me peacing out. Thanks for tuning in to Strategy Simplified.